Greetings everyone, and a very warm welcome to yet another episode of the Weekly Beats. My name is Maggie Mutesi and I am joining you from Dakar. Super excited because we haven't had one of us for a very long time, but I have to say today we have Arnold Segawa back with us. Arnold, it's so good to have you back on this podcast. You can tell from my excitement. What's up?
I'm good, Maggie. How are you doing today? Good to be back. Good to hear your voice too. And good to be part of the Weekly Beat as always.
I know a lot of people have been asking for a very long time, where's the guy with the big voice? Where's Arnold? But anyway, it's always good to have you. And Arnold is joining us from the UAE. What a sad story, Arnold, just the other day of the shooting. And I was watching a video of a 13-year-old US kid who was filmed for about a few hours within town. He was actually not allowed to buy, this was secret filming. This guy was not allowed to buy any alcohol. He wasn't allowed to buy any lottery tickets. But when the camera crew followed him to buy guns, he was able to buy a gun in less than 5 minutes.
It's really quite tragic, and it leaves a lot of questions to be answered on the regulation side. A lot of questions are now going towards the Texas governor Greg Abbott, away from him. Mitch McConnell, who is the minority leader, in the House for the Republicans. So a lot of questions. I don't know if you're a big basketball fan. Steve Kerr, the Golden State Warriors coach, it was a post-game conference and he just broke down and he said, we're not going to talk about basketball. And he was agitated by the fact that there's legislation, like HR 8, which will have grander and more widespreading regulation. That's if, of course, the bill is passed. So yeah, questions like that. But it has been on the floor twice, and none of the Republican senators actually voted on it, and it's quite sad because the law right now, the bill that was passed, I think it's 1993. It does not address issues like online gun sales. You need to patch up some of these laws, which it's expected. If a law is drafted in 1990s, when there was no Amazon or eBay for that matter, it kind of has to evolve. So it's tragic. It's tragic, and I hope now's the time for everyone to act regardless of red or blue. So it was really a tragic day.
What a sad state of events that really happened. Honestly, when you think about it far away, it's just like, okay, this is happening in one of the most civilized, perceived civilized countries in the world. They should.
I like that you made the save and said perceived, because civilization is it comes down to interpretation of civility, and if you're to go there, then I think the Egyptians might beat us to it. The people who occupied what was Mesopotamia, or the ruins of Sumeria. So,
and we've missed your subtle savage humor, and you're joining us from Washington DC. Which brings...
I'm in Virginia. Just a few stone throw away from DC.
Which brings us to actually the topic we're just about to talk now, since you're just not far away from the World Bank, which has come out to say that the war in Ukraine might actually trigger a global recession. I think when Malpass was speaking just the other week, he also mentioned that, this was his statement. As we look at the global GDP, it's hard right now to see how we avoid a recession. But he gave no specific forecast or anything. He just said, this could actually trigger a global recession. And then I've been following events, even, Putin just as early as this morning coming out to say the West really needs to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. He doesn't seem like he's ready to give up. And then you see all of these things, and this is where I'm so happy to have you on the show, because then I'm like, okay, a statement like this, that we might go into a recession. We just had one of the worst economic depressions because of COVID. Something like this, what does it mean, Arnold?
It's quite interesting that we're talking about this. I mean, that the World Bank is no stranger to controversy in the past. But just going with the figures we're looking at, according to their forecasts, they just cut the global growth forecast from 4.1% to 3.2%. And that is a massive figure, a huge percentage point in aggregate GDP growth. That means something. And this has you asking what are they citing for this particular revision in forecasts, and one of them is inflation. I'm sure you read the third opinion. One thing that's hardly ever talked about Ukraine is it is called or dubbed the breadbasket of Europe. No one ever says that.
What?
The way how Switzerland is the pearl of Europe, or Uganda is the pearl of Africa, such statements that are made. This is actually the breadbasket, and a lot of the wheat on the global market, or at least feeding, months of Europe, is actually comes from Ukraine. So, as you remember, food prices have a huge impact on inflation figures.
Absolutely.
So you see where I'm going with this. If wheat actually goes, if production of wheat is cut due to an invasion or a war, depending on where you sit and what you want to call it, that means production is going, supply is going to diminish, and when the supply diminishes, prices are definitely going to climb. And from there we see the inevitable happening, and that's the inflationary pressure that we're seeing in certain parts. Now, there was some sort of reprieve, I think it was April, when India said that they might try to revise their production or increase production, export, and export more wheat to the global market. And then they revised that. They said, no, we're not going to do that. So basically, we're already seeing the repercussion of this. If we're to bring it back to the African continent, we're seeing the repercussions of this in Egypt. There was a bread riot just the other day. And as it turns out, if I'm not mistaken, their biggest exporter of wheat to Egypt is Russia and Ukraine. I stand corrected on this, but per my reading, those are the two that stand out. And those same two are actually involved in a fight. So you can see how this is having a broad repercussion. The same is happening in Iran in terms of bread prices. So it comes as no surprise that this percentage point is actually being factored in by Malpass.
Quite interesting, gives at least the context of what we're looking at globally. I think one of the things he mentioned was also that developing countries were being hit even harder, given the shortfalls of fertilizer and foodstuffs and energy supplies. So obviously I would understand the energy supplies. But I have failed to wrap my head around the fact that, we're importing a lot of, food stocks from Ukraine. I know this is not something anyone would have thought. And I could be wrong. Maybe I'm just, going with what I've read on the internet.
There's some economies that make a huge buzz and make a grand entrances when they're at the World Economic Forum, and there's others that do not make a lot of noise, but you do feel an impact when they sneeze, and that's what we're seeing right now, because as it turns out right now, it's very clear for everyone to see that the likes of Ukraine are having repercussions across the table. And yes, we knew Russia in terms of its supplies for natural gas. And it's going to get very worrying if this persists till winter, because most parts of Europe actually do depend on this natural gas for heating. And we've heard propositions being made by Moscow on natural gas actually payments being made in rubles. Now, this is really twisting an arm, depending on who you ask, because if the central bank of Russia is under sanctions, yes, and then they're making it very clear that we only want receipts to be made in our currency, which is the ruble, where are you going to find the ruble?
I know.
Definitely, that then creates a circle of sorts, because whatever sanctions you held, you now have to find a way to get the rubles by the same central bank that you actually sanctioned. So it's really one to watch, and it's a real tough one to call. I just pray it's one of those that is solved with in an amicable manner in the shortest time possible.
I know there's so much to unpack with this making Russia make sense for global economics, but I think as the war continues, there is really it's going to be a big shift. But as we wind up, because we're running out of time, you know how short it is usually with the weekly beat, I can't let you go without having you talk to us about Africa, Arnold. I mean, the question here is, how do we brace ourselves? I think we get so much excited. I was following the World Economic Forum the other day, and people are still getting excited about the AFCFTA. Not that I've lost hope, really, but I don't see it in the mix as much like I used to probably 2 years ago. Maybe it's the same sentiments you have. But I think that's where the question comes in terms of how do we brace ourselves? Where do we go from here? And, what does the future really look for us as a continent in terms of our economies, in terms of bouncing back, in terms of recovery? How do we mitigate this? Preparedness is very important. I don't even know if this is something our economies are preparing for, but, maybe just we close this is something I could just put across to you.
Thanks for that. I think just practicality is something that has evaded many African economies for such a long time. I always give that example of how we worry about putting elevators in a story building. That should be when you don't have a fence or you don't have an alarm system. So that's something that we need to be looking at, just practicality. Take, for instance, we're now looking at oil prices going back up, and just less than 2 years ago, 2020, we were looking at the pandemic and oil futures were in negative territory. How many African countries can say they filled up reserves at a time where oil futures were in negatives? So people are actually paying more to stay with their reserves, like in the ship, in the tankers. But, how many of the African states actually went ahead and took advantage of this particular...
That's a good question, huh? We just waiting.
And now, and now we're faced with oil at... I have to actually check and see how much oil is right now. I think it's sitting at around 880, if I'm not mistaken. So how many of us actually braced? So actually WTI, as I look right now, is about 115. So Brent is around 119. So it's really about practicality as opposed to building airports. Yet we account for less than 3% of global air travel. I'm not saying we don't need airports. What I'm saying is practicality.
Priorities, yeah.
Yes. And that should be the order of the day. Less colorful conferences, more meaningful stuff, Magufuli style, without jumping on journalists.
That's a good way to look at it. I mean, it makes a lot of sense in terms of where we put our priorities as a continent. But Arnold, we just need a Russia breakdown as often, and I have to say it's always a pleasure reading your third opinion. For me, as a person who enjoys really markets and all of that, it gives me a different perspective, and I hope the audience out there enjoys it. The third opinion is our weekly newsletter that goes out every Friday morning. You can subscribe on Mansa Media's website, www.mansamedia.africa. But I think it's different. I have to say it's different. It's the first of its kind. Arnold breaks down some of this economics in a very simplified way. I am telling you, it's very hard to make sense of some of these big stories, or even something like a recession, starting from where, and as a business person, as an investor, in Africa, how do you even navigate all of this? But these are some of the things you find in the stories rather you find in the third opinion. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Weekly Beat. Arnold, it's so good to have you back. I'm so smiling behind my microphone. I wish I could see you.
Always a pleasure, Maggie.
I know. And always great to learn from you, and it's really great to have you back. And to our loyal listeners, thanks for keeping with us today. We wish you a very wonderful week ahead, and here's to peace and profits. Have a lovely week.